of the same faces kind of sitting here in the audience, and I know it's been, I don't want to say it's been a long day, but it's been a great day. But we are going to, for those of you who are here for, hold on. For those of you who are here with sound frequency healing with sacred geometry and music, so we've had a little change of schedule. So William Kolazansky unfortunately was unable to join us, but we have had the great pleasure and good fortune of Brother Chris Hodapp, who's offered to step in his place and is going to speak to us this afternoon. So, given that I have very little, prepared information about Brother Hodapp, I am just going to say this guy's a fantastic writer. If you haven't read Freemasonry for Dummies, certainly please, take a look at that. It's a fantastic book, and I'm sure there's many other things that Chris has done with his life that I am unaware of, but beyond that, just really pleased to have Chris up here to talk to us this afternoon. And so with that, Brother Chris Hodapp, thank you.
Hello, thanks for coming out today. I apologize. I don't know the first thing about sacred geometry healing with music, and so I hate to disappoint anyone who was staying for that. This is going to be totally different. This will be the only audience participation I do. Knock, knock. Who's there? The Grand Master. You answered after just 2 knocks, and I'm taking your charter off the wall. Okay. Yeah. No, I was actually quite delighted to be invited to step in so I could ruin your afternoon in person. The last time I was in Massachusetts, I weighed about 300 pounds. I got stopped on the sidewalk after the meeting by a cop who told me to break it up, so I thought I better lose weight. And unfortunately, I did it on the cancer and chemotherapy diet, so I don't recommend that one. But at any rate, my wife and I drove here from Indianapolis last week. We bought an Airstream trailer, and we've been traveling around the country last year, and so we actually took a step up to a larger one. So this is our shakedown cruise, coming to the East Coast in April before anybody opens up any campgrounds, because they're like, what do you want to come here for? All the water lines freeze. So at any rate, but we drove here from Indianapolis last week, and we stopped at a rest area in Pennsylvania. And there was a huge 4-foot by 4-foot sign in front of the rest area, and we both wandered over to read it thinking it was a historical marker. And instead, it wasn't that. It was a list of 23 different rules and regulations governing everybody's behavior and responsibilities while walking from their car to go use the bathroom and back. And if those 23 rules weren't enough, then there was also a big long paragraph at the end listing all the state statutes involved and the specific punishments they could mete out if your dog was walked in an unauthorized area or you threw your trash anywhere but an authorized container. So I guess Americans are no longer smart enough to know right and wrong when they stop to take a leak. My latest book, Heritage Endures, is about 200 years of Freemasonry in Indiana, and in it I talk about how Masonic leaders in Virginia and Massachusetts and Pennsylvania in the 1790s decided that Freemasonry could actually be an incredible force for teaching uneducated, undisciplined men on the edges of the frontier how to be civilized and run their democracy and build their communities. It's strange that things seem to have come almost full circle for us as an enlightened fraternity. I'll get to that in a minute. Reverend Dr. James Sherrod Roy was a Grand Master of Massachusetts between 1851 and 53. And in 1966, he published a collection of his old speeches and essay, and the title of the book was called Dare We Be Masons? And in it he said this, he said, first an idea creates the organization, then the organization chokes the idea. We can become so concerned about keeping an organization alive that we forget the ideas and the ideals that gave it birth. We begin by having a great ideal force in our thinking and acting into new channels, and we end by serving the organization. Freemasonry must be a force to be used and not a form to be served. I was struck by past Grand Master Roy's premise, and especially by his title from more than 50 years ago, Dare We Be Masons? And I was struck by it because there's a deepening cultural divide going on right now that involves us as Masons, whether we realize it or not. Namely, it's that our society has shifted cataclysmically in the last 5 decades, and there's now a growing attitude by more and more people very recently of how dare we be Masons. Because of my blog, I scan an awful lot of news stories every day. Back in December, there was a nominee for the U.S. District Court of Nebraska who appeared before the Senate Judiciary Committee for his confirmation hearing. And in the course of being grilled by the various senators over his past judicial record, Senators Kamala Harris and Mazie Hirono specifically called into question that judge's membership in the Catholic men's fraternal organization, the Knights of Columbus. They demanded to know if his membership in this male-only club would prevent him from hearing cases fairly and impartially. And they wanted his strict assurance that he would resign his membership in the Knights of Columbus if confirmed as a justice of the court. Now think about that for a minute. Fraternalism itself seems to be one more item on the chopping block when it comes to scrutinizing the resumes of potential public servants, especially in the age of the Me Too movement. That's never been true in this country, and fraternal memberships used to be something we were all proud of. Back in November last year, there was an article in the Washington Post by a woman in her late 20s named Sadie Dingfelder, who visited the George Washington Masonic Memorial in Alexandria. She knew virtually nothing about Freemasonry before she visited, and she learned almost nothing about it while she was there. She called the memorial nothing more than a monument to a bygone organization from a less woke age. It was a comment on how diminished we've become in the collective American psyche. I thought we had reached rock bottom in that regard back before novelist Dan Brown put Freemasonry back on the map with his books in the early 2000s. The Scottish Rite Northern Masonic Jurisdiction did a survey 2 years ago, and they found that 8 out of 10 respondents had at least heard of Freemasonry, even if they don't know what the hell it was. But as I think back over the last 5 or 6 years now and reflect on my own contacts with the public about it, I fear more people are even less aware of what Freemasonry actually is than in the 1990s. In that same survey, less than 30% actually knew what the values of Freemasonry were, what we believe in. And the most common question I get asked by non-Masons under 35 these days, once I get my basic elevator speech out of the way, is, but just what is it you guys do? What's the point? I've been thinking a lot, not about the millennials, which seems to be the single-minded obsession every Grand Lodge has right now, and not the next generation following, the Gen Z kids. I'm thinking right now more about the next generation. These would be the kids that were born in the year 2000 and later, what some people have called the iGen. According to the Pew Research Center, 40% of all U.S. children today are born out of wedlock. Less than half of American children under 18 today are living in a home with 2 married heterosexual parents in their first marriage, what's quaintly called a traditional family household. 34% of American children today are living with an unmarried parent, usually single mothers, without a live-in partner of any kind to help raise and educate the children. And those numbers get more and more alarming each year. Fewer children today have full-time fathers than ever before in recorded history, and even fewer of them have a father or grandfather to pass along older traditions like Freemasonry and numerous other important values. Back when I wrote Freemasons for Dummies in 2004, there was still a reasonable chance that enough grandfathers had been Freemasons in sufficient numbers that their grandchildren had at least encountered the fraternity at some point in their lives. But as our own membership has dropped over the last few decades, that percentage has done nothing but plummet since then. When you take into consideration all of this stew of statistics, it's clear that Freemasonry as a subject for observation by children and teenagers has a shrinking chance of being passed along to the current and future generations by many fathers, grandfathers, siblings, uncles, or other influential men in their lives. In other words, there's statistically no significant reason why Sadie Dingfelder would have encountered Freemasons in her family. She didn't mention any sort of family connection to the fraternity in her article, so the only way she knows anything at all about us is what she picked up by cultural references she's encountered as a teenager and an adult. like going to the GW Memorial, poking around on the internet, seeing the Simpsons Stonecutter episode or National Treasure, or catching a rerun of A&E or the History Channel if she sits through it. I suspect she may not have a single family member, friend, or acquaintance who is a Mason or has been in recent memory. And if she has children of her own someday, what chance will they have as adults to inherit any sort of collective cultural knowledge of Masonry in another 20 years from now? Given her comments, I suspect she'd disapprove anyway. Note her comments about Masonry being from a less woke era, a colossally imbecilic adjective, if ever one existed. She took the opportunity to swipe that our fraught racial history and continued exclusion of women have also contributed to their diminishing relevance. Now, that's a growing narrative being circulated about us today among upper middle class, college-educated people in this hyper-heightened period of describing every single subject on the face of the earth in terms of gender, race, offense, privilege, and oppression. More and more colleges are demanding the elimination of single-sex clubs on and off campus, like fraternities and sororities. Young people are being taught a dramatically different and arguably damaging version of Western and American history now than any prior generations, and the values, traditions, and institutions of the founders and important historical figures are being derided or ignored altogether. Images of George Washington and Ben Franklin as Freemasons don't carry the sort of positive influence and impact they had even 20 years ago. Some today would even argue they're a negative among increasing numbers of people. And let's not even venture into the demographics regarding religious beliefs among Americans in 2019, or how religious Americans are almost uniformly portrayed in a negative light or just ridiculed by the pop culture and intelligentsia alike. Wholesale contempt for the past has become the current fad of our times. Now, none of this is an indictment of anyone, because there's no single villain we can isolate and counter or argue with or take out behind the barn out back and shoot them. These are just simply the current circumstances we find ourselves struggling in as Masonic leaders of tomorrow. And that's what we're facing going forward as we try to craft messages for the profane world, design our museums, write our books, and sit for interviews in the press or A&E. The culture has shifted under our feet, and this time we find ourselves potentially tap dancing on a minefield. Now, for years, I gave speeches that were full of nothing but unbridled optimism. I told everybody, hang on, the Dan Brown effect, because of his novels, we're going to bring petitioners pounding on the doors. And Masons would sit in the audience thinking, this guy's blowing smoke like the fruit trees are going bad. I spent 25 years in advertising, making regional and national commercials, and we advertising guys used to be accused a lot of being nothing but prostitutes. Well, there's a big difference. You don't pay a prostitute for sex, you pay them to leave. I don't leave. I'm staying right here. I'm always hunting for solutions. My approach to Freemasonry would have gotten me hurled out of the fraternity 50 years ago because I'm a huge believer in promoting it to the outside world. For a couple of important reasons. I'm a big believer in beating on the coffin lid when the crowd is convinced you're dead. But we also need to retain our high standards as the rest of the world loses theirs. You know, the past is sort of like a foreign country. They do things differently there in the past. Jerry Seinfeld was once asked why he wore a suit when he performed on stage. He said, it's a signal that I'm not loafing up here. Freemasonry is sort of the same way. The Danish have a word, Ezekiel. I can't speak Danish, so I make no claim that I'm pronouncing it right. I think it's pronounced Ezekiel. It's an expression of concern about your own honor, about how other people will see and regard you. If you have enough Ezekiel, it helps you to keep you honest. It's why you don't speed and tailgate and give the finger to other drivers when you have a Masonic license plate on your car. Culturally shared moral beliefs that get passed from generation to generation are like a big communal asset that builds and sustains trust within any society. Masonic lodges were designed from the very beginning to pass along manners and civility and trust and honor without any of the baggage that politics or religious denominations brought with them. They were never meant to be a substitute for church, but they were meant to reinforce the common moral lessons that every religion holds in common, along with teaching Masons how to govern their communities and their own behavior. The founders who established the United States, even the cynical ones like John Adams, the open atheists like Thomas Paine, or the laissez-faire deistic ones like Jefferson, realized that the only way that our unique form of government would ever function and survive the uglier side of basic human nature was if the majority of its citizens were what they called habitually correct in their actions. You'll see that phrase a lot. All of them said over and over again that America's ongoing success depended on its founding virtues of honesty, courtesy, responsibility, industriousness, marriage, and religious devotion of some kind among its citizens. Those were all foundations of what became known as the civic religion, and they were all passed on from generation to generation until about 50 years ago. What Abraham Lincoln called the mystic chords of memory, issues of citizenship and solidarity. Freemasonry was part of that ongoing mission. In the late 1700s, the Grand Lodge of Virginia first sent Masonic charters into the wilds of the farthest western frontier in Kentucky, and through them into what eventually became 13 other states, to educate and unite a very small, disparate population of rough pioneers behind an idea of improving the world one single man at a time, binding them together as brothers in a shared vision of tolerance, faith, charity, and understanding. The Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania sent charters up the Mississippi as soon as the Revolution ended for the very same reason. During England's greatest expansion of its colonies around the world, they chartered literally thousands of lodges in every corner of the globe, not as a club for frustrated Englishmen far from home, but to help in the mission to bring enlightenment, civilization, and concepts of equality to the most distant places on earth without the religious conflicts that the churches often brought with them. America and much of Europe today are wildly polarized, socially, politically, culturally, economically, at this very moment in time. The term in vogue today is tribalism, and the world's being divided into more and smaller constituencies with less in common, all clamoring for special treatments or rewards, demanding rights without taking responsibilities. Western society can't survive without the founding virtues. Likewise, I'd argue that Masonic lodges can still survive with fewer members, but successful democratic societies may not do so well without Freemasons. Deliberately neutral ground like a Masonic lodge meeting that expects better, thoughtful, enlightened behavior from its members may be just the place to unite, whereby Masonry becomes the center of union and the means of conciliating true friendship among persons that must else have remained at a perpetual distance. That's what James Anderson originally said it was meant to be in 1723. That's still our basic mission now. Not charities or perfect ritual or Grand Lodge paperwork or the chasing of titles or Masonic degree tourism. No, our mission really and truly is that hackneyed old phrase we parrot back year after year: making good men better ones. We have an enormous problem today that our leaders in Freemasonry and of our own country never would have imagined in their worst nightmares. How can we help nurture any sense of civic duty today when civic society is crumbling around us, when Pennsylvania posts 23 rules about how to act when you take a leak? As a society depends on the passing of knowledge and culture and ideas and history and moral and spiritual values, or it'll implode when its own people who have the control panel in their hands don't know how or why the damn thing doesn't work anymore. As Masons, self-improvement has always been a cornerstone of improving society around us, and that's supposed to be our mission. But we can't improve the world if we can't even improve our own members or keep them coming to lodge long enough to even try. The kids born since 2000, sociologists are already looking very carefully at some of the personality traits they're taking on as a large group. I mean, Oliver Wendell Holmes once said, no generalization is worth a damn, including this one, but they are noticing trends among that next generation born since the year 2000. They're losing interpersonal skills. They've lost the ability to read faces, read facial expressions. They're losing the ability to have logical arguments and discussions. They're solitary. The majority are only children. Most of them have no siblings anymore. Households with more than 2 families are shrinking year after year. 4 out of 10 live with a single parent. That's why we can't drop our standards. These people, these men who will come into our lodges will need mentors. They'll need personal friendships. Things like learning ritual. We've provided all kinds of reading material over the years to give people ritual that you can more easily read on your own. Why would we do such a thing when mentorship is the very basis of this fraternity? Don't let them learn things just on their own. They're supposed to be learning from all of us. We're supposed to be learning from each other. A mentor can explain words and meaning and be a lifelong friend and brother. The suicide rate among teenagers has increased 70% among teenagers just since the year 2007, the first year that the first smartphones went on the market. They will need what we have always been. So many of our new members will eventually come seeking something that our culture used to provide, but we lost the keys to the car for about 25 years ago. Like it or not, we've suddenly had a big, fat, awesome responsibility shoved onto our shoulders as Masons, and especially as Masonic leaders that have never existed before. That's now on your head and mine because we're still here, and we keep coming back every week as these guys cycle through our lodges. It's not fair, but now that family, faith, responsibility, courtesy, honor, and the other founding virtues are falling apart, we're on the front lines now. And we can't take refuge in bingo and spaghetti nights anymore. We're stuck with a job because society won't do it anymore. So many of our future petitioners will be moral and spiritual ciphers, hunting something they can sink their teeth into that reaches into their heads and their hearts without understanding why they need it. They just know that they do. We lose more members to non-payment of dues than we do to deaths. Those were men who came eagerly on their own and saw and left, sometimes in less than a year. We need to back off worrying so much about putting brand new butts on seats and start worrying a whole lot more about how we keep them there. Most important lodge meeting in a Mason's entire career is his fourth one. The next meeting after his Master Mason degree. That's the meeting he'll measure the entire fraternity by. The meeting in which he sees whether his lodge lives by the precepts they taught him in his degrees, whether he wants to come back, and whether his lodge wants him back too. When a man joins a lodge, we've got to invest in him. We have to give him a little piece of ownership of your lodge that's now his too. Whether that's giving him a key to the front door, giving him his first small degree part to learn, or letting him repaint the lobby, or tasking him with finding some inspirational artwork to hang in the lodge, or become the lodge librarian, or update the website, or find a guest speaker, or call all the widows, or cook dinner, or find a local school to help, or just be a committee of one. But for God's sakes, can we please throw out that tired, backward, victim-shaming, blame-shifting BS that says you get out of Masonry what you put into it, bromide out with the trash. A lodge gets out of her Masons what she puts into them, and not a drop more. They aren't going to care about their lodge any more than their lodge cares about them. And if we tell a new Mason, just sit there and shut up till we want something from you, and discuss nothing at our meetings besides the problems with the plumbing and the boiler, and then only communicate with him after his degrees by sending him a dues notice at Thanksgiving, and then we have nobody to blame but ourselves when he tosses it into the shredder, vanishes, and quits. We alone create the worst salesman against this fraternity because they'll spend the rest of their lives telling their friends who ask about maybe joining the Masons, I tried it, don't bother. We rob ourselves when they leave us. It's when lodges stop serving the needs of their members that they fail because nobody has to come back to next month's meeting. If Netflix movies are more interesting than lodge, then shame on us, and guilt is a lousy motivator. Nobody shows up twice if they're begged or nagged over it, or if somebody calls them at home and demands them to come in and be a lodge officer. And after you stay away for the second meeting, it gets easier every time. If a lodge is nothing but a place you dread and meet and flee from, as soon as the gavel falls, it needs to fix itself or it needs to close. We don't have too many lodges. We don't have too many buildings, but we don't have too many lodges. My friend Jeff Naylor once said, if you can get enough Master Masons together who like to dress up like train engineers And want to start Lionel Lodge number 769. Let the cheer go up and celebrate the charting of their lodge. These guys have got something in common. They want to pull together and appeal to a particular group of men whose interests aren't contrary to the fraternity and who might just bring quality men into Freemasonry. Don't fight it, embrace it, promote it. Lodges should have the widest possible freedom to adopt customs and practices that suit them, to customize, as long as they're proficient in ritual, to open and close meetings and manage to get their degrees conferred by themselves or maybe with help from other lodges around them. Let them make it the lodge that suits their members, whatever that means. With almost no exception anymore, a man can join any lodge in his state. They need to compete with each other for the hearts and minds of each candidate and active members by their activities and customs. The greatest period of competition in fraternalism was back in the 1920s, when it was still that burgeoning golden age of fraternalism. And it wasn't just Masonic lodges that were competing for everybody's hearts and minds. It was the Oddfellows and the Red Men and the Woodmen and the Grange and all these other fraternal organizations. And they were all trying to compete with each other and outdo each other, because it was a lot of the same guys that were joining all those same lodges. But the one that they attended was the one that they felt more like they were a part of. And we need to start thinking about that again, because we've gotten a little lazy without that competition to goad us anymore. Why have 100 lodges if they all do exactly the same thing? If a man isn't finding what he wants in his lodge and his lodge isn't letting him be a part of making any alterations, give him the hope of at least finding one that does meet his needs, not more of the same. Freemasonry is universal. It's just not uniform, that's all. Some lodges have tried to add practices like a chamber of reflection, contemplative music, candlelight, or other customs in a few jurisdictions. And in response, a few Grand Masters have come down like the wrath of God on them for doing it. Suspensions, trials, expulsions, charters yanked, Masonic careers wrecked, all because the men in a lodge were trying to improve the lodge experience for their own candidates, instead of just saying to them, "Your check cashed, welcome to Freemasonry, now give us your pants." That's madness. And we've all visited those hospice lodges that would rather close and give up their charter than do anything different. No Grand Lodge anywhere at any time in the history of the fraternity ever forced one single lodge to be a bad one or give its candidates an unmemorable initiatory experience. No Grand Master or Grand Lodge ever demanded a lodge have a crumbling temple, disgusting and broken furniture that should be cleaned and then burned, lousy ritual, terrible food with suspicious meat, sandwiches, and prison coffee, and flat Sam's Club pop, no programming, no attempt at actual fellowship, cheap dues that doesn't pay the light bill, but most of all, perfect proficiency at backstabbing each other in the parking lot. Grand Lodges can provide tools and advice. We've all come up with lots of them, all over the world, just within my memory. But only the local lodge can demand greatness of itself and not become that most terrible of things, ordinary. I asked my wife how many really great speakers are there in the world, and she said one fewer than you think. So I'll wind this up. But Brother Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, the French Masonic world explorer, and if you took French class in high school, you might have had to read The Little Prince. He was the author of that. Fascinating guy. He once wrote, "If you want to build a ship, don't herd people together to collect wood, and don't assign them tasks and work, but rather teach them to long for the endless immensity of the sea." This little club of ours is supposed to be mythic, visionary, legendary, because your job, my job, all of our job is to teach them to long for the endless immensity of the sea that is Freemasonry. Every single day, not just your year as master, but every single year. I'm in my 20th year as a Mason. I'm a lousy ritualist, a decent researcher, and I hope I'm okay at turning a phrase every once in a while. But the idea of Freemasonry is what I still love, regardless of how it's presented. I'll tell anybody who asks, I'm a shameless shill for this fraternity. Guilty as charged. I want us to grow and again take our proper place at the center of our communities. I'd love for Freemasons to build the tallest skyscraper in the world again, just like we did in Chicago in the 1890s, when we built the tallest building in the world for everybody in the country and the world to look up at in awe and admiration. But what I want a hell of a lot more than that is for Masons to take that place. Instead of a building, I want the whole world to look way up at us with awe and admiration. I want us to be big again, a big idea that we all live up to. Men don't join the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts or Rhode Island or a club called the Freemasons. They join to become Freemasons. They join because of the idea of what becoming a Freemason is to them. I certainly did. I have no doubt that you did too. I hope so, anyway. But all these new members will never love Freemasonry until our own existing members love it first. Our purpose today is more needed than ever before. Don't doubt that for a second. Every single man who has ever knocked on the door of every single Masonic lodge on the face of the earth has that longing for the endless immensity of the sea that's Freemasonry that I talk about, that dream of becoming a Freemason. Don't let lodges become places in the business of wrecking those dreams, but of fulfilling them. When the men we already have want to come back more and stay and can't wait to be there and show up weekends and in the snowstorm and after a lousy day at work when he has all kinds of better reasons to stay at home instead, but he still comes back every month or every week here. When every single one of us longs for that endless immensity of the sea that's Freemasonry, then we can go back to worrying about going out and finding more candidates and not 1 minute more. Thank you.